Let me tell you about Arch, where I get all my clothes and honestly what I am wearing right now on this podcast. They nail that perfect balance between style and comfort without breaking the bank. From the first time I was in the shop, the experience with Arch has been incredible. The personalized recommendations, attention to detail, and delivery is what really sets them apart. Whether on the golf course, hitting the gym, or heading into the office, Arch has me covered with polished, elevated pieces that keep me feeling confident, comfortable, and stylish all day. They make sure every aspect of your wardrobe is taken care of, blending versatility with a premium feel, all while keeping it accessible. If you're looking for a brand that delivers an exceptional experience from start to finish, Arch is where you'll find it. Visit them in the Van Aken district in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and let them know you heard them on the Journey podcast. Welcome to the Journey podcast, a show dedicated to health, wealth, and happiness. Join us on the journey while we explore the world your health and wealth make possible. Welcome back to the Journey podcast. Today we are joined by Buddy Huttanus. Buddy's a sports scientist with experience working alongside elite athletes, World Cup winners, and professionals, along with being a father, husband, son, and an athlete. Buddy, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to us catching up a little bit and also sharing some of my experience.
Yeah. And you say catching up, I'll kind of set it up because you and I go back quite some time. I moved to Arizona in 2006, and I think I met you probably within 18 months or so of moving out that way. And, when I would say one thing you and I, got close over the years, a lot of it because of something I talk a lot about on this podcast. Running, sports, Ironman, and all the other things. So, but I'll kind of take a bigger step back because I'm sure we'll get to that in more detail. But tell me how you got here, right? I use the term sports scientist to open up. But I know you've kind of served a number of different roles to get here. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's definitely been a little bit of a journey. I think within sports now, all of this is kind of a holistic approach, whether you have sports science, you have sports medicine, you have performance, different arms that are more integrated than ever now. But originally, graduating from college, I actually had a sports medicine background as an athletic trainer with a leg of sports performance that led me to finding my first position out in Arizona, working in a PT clinic that did outpatient rehab, but also youth performance within soccer teams and a variety of other athletes. So it was a great place because I was able to kind of hone in on some of my sports medicine skills, but also led me to a little bit of a transition more into the performance side, while also being able to train for triathlon, get more involved in the endurance side of things, which I didn't really start until my senior year of college. So it was a nice spot. And then it led me to meeting people like yourself and others, but to where I was able to not only train myself, but look at kind of variety of ways to train others as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the training others. I could tell your story. I do to other people, to friends that I run into about this friend of mine, Buddy, who I've known for a long time. But, how did that progress? I know when you left, you were doing a lot of that there in the physical therapy side. But then when you left Arizona, I think it was a pretty big leap into kind of your track.
It was probably a bigger leap and a jump than I anticipated and expected. I think I always felt quite confident in myself. I felt confident in training myself. I felt confident in the youth athletes that I worked with. But it's, I think, a different side of things, kind of when you get to a level where you're dealing with more experienced athletes, very talented athletes, especially whether you're at a university or the professional level. There comes just a certain amount of expectation. And when I got to the University of Oklahoma, I was lucky enough to kind of get referred into a role there, working with the women's soccer team. And I had this grand expectation of hey, this is a Division I team. All these athletes are going to be intrinsically motivated and great. I'm not going to have to really do a thing. But it was quite different from that. And it was also different from myself of what I thought I knew and what I thought I could apply kind of completely got thrown out the window in the first 2 years. And luckily enough, I had a great boss who was patient with that. But it was probably the best learning experience that I've had within the 5 years that I was at the University of Oklahoma, of really understanding how athletes are different from the expectation of whether you're a Division I athlete or professional athlete, that everybody, operates a little bit differently, and you can have to adjust how you apply your methods to that, and also have to rethink some of your methods, to basically help everyone optimize their training and to be at their best to perform.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you mentioned was the intrinsic motivation piece, which is something I talk a lot about in my role over here, right? In the coaching space, I talk a lot about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. And I think it's interesting that you got, on the ground, right? I mean, you think about the glide path of an athlete. We all start playing sports at a young age, and then it dwindles down as middle school and high school comes around, and then you get into college, right? And you were at the D1 level, but it goes anywhere from across the spectrum, D3, D2, D1, and a multitude of other spaces. And then what I think is really interesting is your next pivot from there, right? Where you took that really big leap when it comes to performance level or platform level. Talk a little bit about that next jump in career path.
Yeah, but it's being there at the Division I level is, again, it's still pretty big across if you think about a national aspect. I mean, there's tons of teams. There's Division I, there's Division II. The next step within that was kind of finding more of a niche within U.S. soccer and the national level of teams, and starting out within the youth level. And it was really around the similar age of athletes that I had worked with, the 18 to 22-year-old. But these athletes that I was starting to work with U.S. soccer were the best of the best, and looking to kind of make that ultimate leap to representing your national team, whether that be at the World Cup, a Youth World Cup, or the Olympics. So that my experience at Oklahoma definitely gave me a broader example of, I know I need to kind of learn the athlete that I'm working with and adapt to a little bit of their needs, but still also apply the principles that we know that are tried and true, but also along with the innovation that is coming out of research. So transitioning to U.S. soccer allowed me to kind of express what I was doing, but also it helped me perform better myself. So I had to learn more. I needed to be able to articulate different methods, explore different methods with athletes, and then apply those at a different setting, at a much higher level. And so starting out kind of with the youth age groups, I worked through that for a couple of years, and that ultimately led me to working with the senior national team and being under Don Scott, Dr. Don Scott, who is, a legend in her own right, and kind of being able to sit at a different seat where I wasn't the head of the performance side of things, but I was able to kind of still apply my craft, but also watch and learn from one of the best.
Yeah, I mean, again, what's really interesting is some of the words you used, the last few minutes. And what I mean is, right, you were talking about, hey, understanding the athlete at whatever level and making sure there's some customization there, but also bringing your expertise and knowledge in training and kind of giving that framework and then kind of tweaking within there. So I think, when you think about it, I'm 45. I am very far away from an elite level, but back to that kind of experience I had with you while we were both doing a lot of those kind of fun things, and you were my de facto coach or trainer for a lot of those years. And we'll come back to your work within the soccer space, from college to the USA Women's Program, and to a picture I'll share when we put this out, you kind of holding the World Cup trophy at some point. But love to understand kind of those lessons in that mashup. And what I mean by that is, you've trained at all of the high levels, but you've also kind of brought that down in your own performance training and for others. Like, where do you see the connections or the intersections there? Because what we do here at Journey Well, is try to bring a lot of that. And one of the two of the key pillars we talk about is mental and physical wellness, right? And that's kind of your expertise. So could you kind of take all that elite background and kind of bring it down to,
Mhm.
this side of it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you kind of look at the elite background side of it, and I think people get the impression that professional athletes have, super highly specific training programs that are outrageous, different than what we do on an average daily basis while we're at home, with our careers, with our families, etc. But it still really starts with a foundation, and also kind of I always refer to it as you're at where you're at, and I think it's really determining what your capacity is at the moment and understanding how to work with that capacity to build a great foundation for your health and for your wellness, to then take on some more of the specific type things that need to happen to then perform better. And we all know some of the benefits of exercise. We know the benefits of what it can do from us for a wellness side. But if you don't have an understanding of kind of where you're at and you try to do something outside of your capacity, usually there's going to be an increased risk of injury. And then what does that do? It kind of halts our process and then basically causes us to kind of start back over again. So what I take kind of within myself, and then also again just within my peers and groups of friends that we have, and when we kind of talk about training, or we have friends that are doing a 5K, it's kind of setting your expectations and understanding that if you're consistent and you kind of enjoy the process along with it, and you don't necessarily push with outside of that capacity, you're likely going to get to your results, one, feeling so much better. And then by the time that say that race comes along, or that goal you've come so close to is really within reach, you're going to be able to perform a lot better because you've set the foundation by being consistent, and understanding where you're at, and then building upon that, it's not comfortable. It takes some diligence, and there is some uncomfortable parts and different stimulus is needed to kind of reach that goal. But really kind of understanding, hey, I'm consistent right now. This is where I'm at. And if I stay on that track, I'm usually going to find some success and be able to perform better. And it's no different with the elite athlete. Is they need to have a foundation to be able to perform. And if they don't have that foundation from the highly specific stuff they have, you almost need to, they don't really have that general kind of building block to help sustain a lot of that specialized training.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really thoughtful. I love the phrase, like, you're at where you're at. And one thing you started with was like, hey, they have these really elite custom programs that are intricate and detailed. Could you elaborate a little more on that? Because I think that is a really excellent point. I think a lot of people, when they get started, especially within physical wellness, when it comes to recovery, strength and cardio, right? Like, people can go down these rabbit holes and look for the most complex type
Yeah.
programs, or saying, I need, in the recovery side, right? Like, I need Normatec boots, and I need a Theragun, and I need every other piece of equipment, and I need the Aura ring, and I need the Apple Watch. I need that new bed that measures my temperature. And it's funny, harkening back to those days, like, you would tell me, like, you need a lacrosse ball, you need a golf ball, maybe a band. And like, that's about it. And now you can get all
Yeah.
that for about $15.
Yeah.
When it comes to things. So you talk more about all of that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. I think it's like, if we were to look at it kind of like on a spectrum of we know elite athletes and even elite endurance athletes, they have something very specific at the end of that spectrum. And yes, you do need some specific training to adapt to that. But to get there, you really just have to start within a general focus. And we know, like, within research and literature will show you that if you strength train, if you, do cardiovascular exercise, like, you're going to have a lot of benefits to that. So when I kind of like state that, hey, you're at where you're at, and we're going to start here at a foundation, it's really basic, mundane exercises in different planes of movement for us to target all the potential things that may happen. And so if we're able to kind of control movements, get better at our proficiency with that, when we start to, progress into some more complex things or more high intensity, we know that stimulus isn't going to have necessarily a negative impact on us. So even with athletes coming into an off season, right after the season, we would normally give them, 2 to 3 weeks off. From there, they're literally working out 3 times a week, 3 to 4 times a week. And I'm telling you, from a cardio side, it's, a run, a 20-minute run with 1 minute on, 1 minute walk. Really basic stuff to introduce your body into that pattern of loading, of, hey, this is what my body feels like running again. Hey, I'm going to do a strength training workout that it may just be 4 or 5 exercises in different planes, just going through body weight. Because we know by just starting with those incremental gains, it's going to help prepare them for when the high intensity or the more complex stuff comes later.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like, you just, reflecting on it, you're 1 minute run, 1 minute walk. Like, how simple could it
And
possibly be?
it's athletes get so frustrated at times because they're like, this is so easy. And it's like, it's okay. It's okay to be easy, because when it's easy, you got money in the bank. And when you have money in the bank, you can show up the next day and you can still do stuff. And it's like, if you were to withdraw too much, that may take 2, 3, 4 days to recover from. You're losing training days. And when you lose training days, it's much harder to adapt to that. And so that's been kind of just my common theme is like, let's take a little bit out here. Let's take a little bit out here, because we know the next day we can replenish that if we recover right. Do we get sleep? Yes. Do we eat well enough from a nutritional standpoint? Yes. Okay, there's 2/3 to it. Now it's like, what's our stress look like? And I think right now at the times, we know we have some holidays coming up. So if our side of things, where we know we have family, we're going to have get-togethers, we're going to have holiday parties, we may have end-of-year deadlines for work, is like, that's going to provide stress. And if we don't have the foundation from the physical side, that's only going to compound to that and lead to maybe some more fatigue, lead to an illness, lead to an injury. And that's something that we want to manage is did we ease into stuff the correct way and kind of progress to it the correct way? Did we manage some of our stress, knowing that I have a holiday party, I have my kid's game on the weekend? How do I manage that? Because if I don't manage it, or if I don't, expect that it could potentially have a negative outcome on me, then it's going to be harder the following week to follow up on some of the goals or some of the things you want to do.
Yeah, that's great. I love, again, kind of the idea of like money in the bank, and staying on that theme. You've coached or trained kind of the spectrum, right? To the average individual, to, again, like the World Cup, champions, right? What is like a good example you've seen in both, in terms of what happens when they don't align with that advice, to kind of phrase it kindly?
Well, on the athlete side, they're generally going to go down a road to whether either poor performance is going to occur within their sport, or they're going to come and say, I feel tired. Why do I feel tired? Or injury at its worst could happen. Whether now the severity of that injury could be small, or you may be able to get away with it a little bit, or it could be a major injury. And that's where that impacts a lot of their career. And then from our side of things, I think is when you're kind of averagely, I'm trying to push for a race and I'm trying to train. And, this week I ended up running 20 miles a week, and the next week I ran 50 miles a week. Well, because I had a lot of stress at work, because I had a lot of stress on my body from the physical side of things, now I've picked up an illness. Now, what's that do to me? What's that do to my family life? Well, like, am I able to go to work, etc.? So those are kind of the ends of the spectrum that you can see, where if you're an athlete, you're losing out on playing time and performance. And if you're, kind of along the lines of us, is like, if we're sick and we miss days of work, what does that do? Or if we're sick and stuff, do we miss, a family event? Do we miss a game, etc.? So being able to kind of manage that, and if you kind of go outside of those where you're at within your capacity, that's generally when you're going to see some negative impacts happen within your performance as well as your wellness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great example. And that kind of leaps into the other one we talk a lot about here. And I know you have seen this probably better than anyone, is in that kind of the mental wellness space, right? Like, what does the impact of that, and, how does it show up on that mental wellness side, right? Like, an elite
I,
athlete with that injury, right? Or an individual training for a race, what are the implications that you have seen?
yeah, I mean, from one end, and I could even just speak from self experience, I think you just get demotivated at times. And if you don't kind of have at least that motivation of, hey, this goal that I've set for myself or part of, this training program can like actually help me and lead to a better quality of life. Like, and you don't feel motivated by doing that. You're just going to extend the window that you don't train, which is going to overall reduce your capacity. So it's going to make the road kind of to start back up and to get back to that goal much harder. And from an athlete side, I think they start just to second guess themselves at times. And whether they come out of it, it's like, hey, I have this bit of adversity. And you've seen it both ways, some that are highly, accept it, motivated, and well beyond it. And then others that it does take a little bit of a process to get back to where they feel their best is and they're back to their potential can take some time, especially if you're coming off from an injury and it's, I'm not able to do what I used to do. And I think as we age, we get to that point. It's like, well, I'm not able to run 50 miles a week right now. And it's no different from the athlete side as, well, I was able to run at this speed, and within my realm, we look at, top speed, what they hit in the session. Well, I'm, 1 to 2 miles per hour off of that, 1 to 2 kilometers off of that. Like, why can't I do that? And so you ask yourself a lot of why questions. And I think when you do that, you start to second guess, and you're not really involved in the process. You're going to be looking for ways to shortcut things, and we know that's not always the best.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're sharing is, sounds spot on. And I think what's really interesting, and I hope people take away, is, right, we started with the idea of like, hey, there's, elite level athletes, and then there's us, the average amateurs, right? And there's this massive gap. And there is, to a certain extent, right? I'm not playing in the NBA or pitching in the MLB, but what I think is really interesting is a lot of the issues that they face, and an average individual, right? They're the same. There's the
Yeah.
injury, the demotivation, kind of the getting down on yourself, and all the things, for example, that come from that. How do you deal with that, especially at the elite level, right? Like, in your role over this, the many years you've been doing this, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah. And I think the places I've been at, we've been really lucky to have a really good kind of, say, performance team. And it's like, if you were to look at high performance and a holistic approach to that, where you have, medical professionals within that, you have mental health professionals within that, you have the performance side of my role within that as well, is I know that from some of the objective things that I look at from a performance side, if things aren't adding up, and especially within a return to play cases, I can refer out, or I can, within our team, we can guide that athlete into certain situations. And then that becomes a communication thing within your team. Your team kind of behind the team is, hey, these are things we see. Why is this happening? How is it impacting the athlete? How can we set that athlete up for some success? And by doing that, by understanding, hey, I have these resources available to me, we can kind of pass those along. So I've been really lucky to have that within the NWSL in San Diego, also within the U.S. national team, and even at Oklahoma had great resources for us to kind of, one, collaborate from my side of things, the performance side, but also the mental health side of things, and well as the medical side of things.
Yeah, notice you've used the word a few times, holistic. And it's something we talk a lot about here. I think, you and I, in side conversations outside of this podcast, have talked about what we talk about, the four pillars, right? Physical, mental, spiritual, and financial wellness. And right, the financial wellness, of course, shows up, especially if your career is sports, but it's really more integrated around time and what's important to you, which shows up for a lot of amateur athletes, right? Also. And I think that's what's really interesting. You just said, hey, how do you set up for success? And it's all of these kind of holistic resources that support the individual,
Yeah.
both from an elite perspective to an amateur perspective. How have you seen that even change since you have gotten into this space, right? From your early days at Oklahoma all the way to kind of the women's professional league, and now kind of in the world you're in now, which is really the data and analytics side.
I mean, information's available. And I think at times information and the way you can kind of go about gathering that information is available. But then the next step is, okay, we have this information. Well, how do we apply it? I think that's where some of the steps in literature, even from a mental health side of things, and it's like, what can we help, or what resources can we create, and what information can we gather to help flag some of these potential risks? And I use risk as a term because for me it's like, if somebody's not feeling so great today, or if we do a wellness questionnaire with a lot of our athletes at the beginning of the day, and they come in and they say, I'm stressed out. I'm stressed out and I have a bad mood. Okay, well, why is that? Like, we can flag that. All it does is help create a discussion, and having that information and looking back on that information and then following the trends helps us hopefully be proactive within any type of issue that may come about. And if we're proactive and we can get better help earlier, and the sooner the better, we can hopefully, set that athlete on a better path to kind of get back to where their norm. And that's one thing within the data that we collect, is like, we want to kind of be within the norm more often than not. And so it's like, how do we identify when we're outside of the norm? And then, okay, what is the process to then get back into the norm?
Oh, that's really, I mean, right, because really, you're really talking about is like, there's this continuum, and if you're on the continuum, how do you move up and down the scale, right? Ideally, to your point, using that term, the norm. If you're sitting here, that's a great space to be, because when we need to go up the continuum, right, we can do that on game day.
Yeah.
Certain practices, but you can't thrive at that level all the time,
Oh,
right?
no.
You're definitely going to have days where you go down that other side. How do you address that? Because I think what you're really talking about is just so much that parallels to kind of just people like you or I, right, who have, exercised for a very long time, or have careers and families and jobs, but also trying to pursue many things at certain points in their life. Like, how do those run in parallel with what you've seen at the elite side all the way down?
Yeah, I think it's like, when I talk about the norm, and I think especially kind of what I do within my role of sports science is you hit it right on the head, is if we want to go up or progress in one way, it's more manageable to do that. Or if we need to scale back a little bit, it makes it more manageable to do that. When the elite side, when you have massive swings or big spikes in whatever you're doing, that's where it either adds a lot of stress or you don't get stressed enough. So you're constantly going between two different extremes, which then ultimately could lead to burnout, could lead to an injury, and so on. And then if you scale that back on the other side, is we have to kind of set our expectations a little bit differently. Whether you have a family, what's your career demands, what are you trying to schedule within your week to also like chase those performance goals. And if we don't have some of those right, then we can't necessarily progress, or it's not a right time to progress or go up that continuum. It's being able to, okay, identify, hey, you know what, I'm sitting a little bit more, on the low end of my norm right now. How do I just get back right to where I need to be? And then how do I, if I want to go beyond that, how can I progress in that way? So I think when you see it kind of from the athlete side of things, is as we're going through a season, the more we're in the norm, I think it maintains performance. And if you can maintain performance more often than not, you're going to be consistent. And the same side of things is when we're able to maintain kind of our lifestyle and balance and still be able to get in our exercise, but still manage some of the outside stressors that we have, then generally we're probably going to be in a better headspace and be more enjoyable and be able to do a variety of other things that we want to do.
Yeah, that's really well said. And again, we've chatted, countless hours over the years, and in some of the stories you have shared, I think it's really interesting because you've coached in a very interesting time. If we look at like the last 10 or 15 years, right? Like when you talk about stress, both from an athlete perspective, on the field and all the things they go through, and then outside of that, right? The world has gotten way bigger, right? More is now included in that. How have you seen kind of elite athletes deal with that, or start to deal with that, or what have you seen show up? And then how would you apply that to just someone like myself who's experiencing those things, right? Who's trying to run, some marathon in the spring, but then has a career and has kids and they're in sports and all the stuff that goes with that.
Yeah, I think from the elite athlete side of things, it's they're more open and they're more aware of it now, which is good, which helps the conversation be had that if you're coming into, your practice week or your game week, they're okay with sharing the information to help kind of find that. And then they understand that there's resources out there to help them. I think from our side of things, it's, you still know that, hey, this is in the age of information and the age of and resources that people have been able to identify this. And I think it's kind of accepting, hey, this has happened, or this is currently like a situation that I am. What can I reach out to do to help that situation? And it's much harder, I feel like, from our side of things, where it's like, how do we kind of go about that? And it's tough too, because you're trying to put on a front every day, and you're trying to go through your career, your daily work tasks, you're trying to go through your daily family tasks that may go on. It's hard to stop and identify that and say, hey, I may need to go to this resource. I may need to put a pause on some of my physical goals right now to help realign myself with that from the mental side or from the stressor side, or how do I reduce some of the stress? We know stress is going to be there, but I think it's really identifying or trying to be a little bit proactive when it's coming, how to adjust the other side of things.
Yeah, I think that's really thoughtful. I think, I love the fact that you mentioned you guys do like a wellness assessment. Potentially each day someone comes in or asking that question. What are some of those questions? Maybe not specifically within the wellness assessment from an elite athlete perspective, but how would you translate that? Like, what should someone start to ask maybe each morning or each week?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard. Like, and you can find a lot of the information out. Like, there's a lot of, literature out on it of just subjective questionnaires. Again, it is subjective. It does require you to be a little bit consistent and then kind of like learn the trends or see the trends of whether that be yourself or, if you're evaluating somebody else. But I think is number one, did you sleep well? Okay. How, like, if you slept, was that quality sleep or were you tossing and turning? Two, what's your stress like? Are you, do you have a high amount of stress? Do you feel even keeled? Do you have a low amount of stress? What's the next question, kind of what's your mood? Are you irritable today? Sometimes we go through weeks where it's just like, you're not feeling it. It's tough to kind of communicate. It's tough to put on that face. And then the later side of things is if we're in a performance business and we need to know how you're going to operate that day, it's like, are you sore? What specific areas are sore? And then that would just help us identify, okay, well, we may need to just modify some of your training session today. And then from, like, if you're taking this in within yourself, it's really simple just to say, did I sleep well? No. Am I stressed? Yes. Okay, what's that going to do to my workout? Especially if you're training for a marathon. I have a 20-mile run today. Well, that's a lot of stress. So maybe if you had, a couple of days where you ask yourself those questions and you're saying, I'm still stressed, I haven't slept well, is that 20-mile run really going to help you? I think in part, potentially, but maybe there just needs to be some modification to that. To whether if you had some marathon race pace, intervals put into it, maybe we just need to scale back on that and it becomes kind of a run walk. find how you can get through kind of that high stress physical task. You'll still get the benefit from it, but also you're not going to put yourself in a much further hole because of the other 2 days or work stress or life stress that has come about.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think just the idea of like asking those questions, right? Whether you're training for something or not, like asking those questions in
Yeah.
general, right? They can show up in a lot of different ways because to your
And
point.
it's not that it's going to have to dictate kind of what you do next from it, but it's identifying and being aware that it's okay to have a little bit of modification. You can still do whatever you had planned, but just be okay with modifying it because that's going to get you to the next day. And then ultimately you'll kind of come out of that and you'll feel much better from it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, because everything you're saying runs very much in parallel, right? From an elite perspective all the way down, where someone's there talking about, how do I show up in my life? If I didn't sleep well, I'm not eating well, I'm not feeling great. How am I going to show up in dealing with my kids, or how am I going to show up in dealing with my spouse? How am I going to walk in the door to the office, right? All of that impacts. So how do I even scale back? Maybe not even talk about the workout, right? I mean, how do I scale back what I'm going to do this day from a professional perspective, or being very conscientious about how you show up with that mindset.
Yeah.
And asking those.
I think in part of my career in my last stop when I was in San Diego, I was in a camper van. So, adjustment from family life is like a work day could be pretty hectic and busy from the time you kind of walk into the office with meetings, with training and so on, that, I just didn't have the drive to want to go out and go through my daily workout and get some sort of physical output, because that's almost like the face that I have to put on. So at times what has helped me, just, and I still do it to this day, is like I just go walk. Like, even walking to me is still some sort of physical exercise that, again, you could walk for an hour, you could walk for 2 hours. That's still going to be a pretty big stressor in your body. So that was a way that I kind of managed that within myself, even though, almost every day I was working with some sort of specific workout or planning with that for other people. And also somewhat demonstrating it myself, that by the time it came around to take care of myself, I lost some of that motivation. So what helped me a lot to reset that was just going out and walking and kind of clearing your head.
Yeah, and I think I want to take all this because I would be remorse if I didn't ask a couple questions just based on your expertise and background. A lot of what we're talking about we can apply as individuals, right? I'm someone who is in my old age still trying to chase some of these races, but I'm also a parent now, and you are too. And for example, at the firm here, we work with a lot of parents, and I do within the coaching side. But I think it's really interesting when we talk about what is kind of playing out in this space too when it comes to young athletes. And you have a lot of expertise in that space. How are you seeing all of those things we just discussed showing up in kind of the youth sports space or the youth athlete space? Like, how can we take a lot of these lessons and start to apply them there? Because this is a big one for me specifically.
Yeah. I mean, and everybody's aware of it. Like, everybody is aware of, sports performance, sports science. It's now just become part of our everyday. If you have a youth athlete, it's in there, and the kids are aware of it as well. But it still applies to them, of kind of understanding, what's their capacity, and then what do they ultimately want to get to? Like, is that the goal that they have set? Is it more of, hey, I just want to be better, so by the time I get to high school, I'm going to be on varsity, I'm going to be able to perform and compete on varsity? Or is it, you know what, I just want to win our championship in this 3-month little league season that I have? But I think it's putting some perspective on that and understanding that, the more specific we go, at times we lose out some of that general foundational building. And within youth sports, there's, things go around year, like you can go from basketball to football to baseball, like things can happen. And we know that, youth baseball can go year round, youth soccer can go year round, because that's still specific to the sport itself is what are you doing on the other side to help kind of get that general foundation, whether that be movement proficiency, whether that be, stress regulation from a lot of these games that they're playing 2 or 3 times a week, to also just reset and then allow them to experience a little bit of different stimuluses and different movements. And so I think it's still there to manage, but I think it's like, what's the capacity that we have right now? Do I want to go all in on that capacity, or do I want to kind of manage that? And I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to get around it. Is it's okay to kind of slow things down with it, and then just lay that foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I heard, for example, was right. It can be a lot, in terms of not only the performance part. Playing the same sport, for example, year round, can put a lot of stress both on you mentally and physically, right? It's, especially physically, right? This shows up, and as an avid reader and follower of baseball, right, you're seeing it for a lot of pitchers, right? A lot of injuries are showing up much earlier because of that repetitive motion, and some of the things from the data side about exit velocity and some of the other kind of the stress on the elbow, right, that is showing up in data and analytics. And youth soccer, right? Like, better than anyone, like when you're making that cut over and over and over again, what that does to you physically.
Yeah. And it's like, I think the biggest thing that I've seen within high school, kind of like junior high to high school athletes, is they still have, at times a heavy academic load. And whether it's if you're kind of requiring, practice to be from 4 to 6, and then that dinner range comes within that, a lot of times it's just kids miss out on kind of, some, what's that nutrition look like? And then they're starting their homework, which is another stressor outside of that, 10 p.m. and then trying to get through that and then trying to get up and do that the next day. And sometimes they may have an early practice. So we're almost doing them a disservice by not kind of organizing that schedule. And I think it's fine to kind of, if your choice is to go year round and play one sport, but how are you going about the ebbs and flows to that? How are you managing that? It's like, are you optimizing when they look at their academic workload? Are you trying to help optimize their sleep, making sure that they're getting enough food? Because all of that, it's like, if we don't manage it, that's where you tend to see a lot of the youth injuries come up. And especially, we know within female soccer, ACLs prevalent. It's prevalent with all soccer, male or female. A lot of that can just be, to me, is are they just fatigued? And then they have just another stressor to go to. And we didn't manage that fatigue well enough.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is kind of like when you take everything that you shared throughout the day, right? Because like linking that back to things that I also feel or talk about with, again, from an adult perspective, right? Is, hey, if you're doing those things, it's time away from something else, right? So you mentioned like, hey, 4 to 6 practice, come home and do homework, whatever else may be layered on that. Like, do you have time to kind of like mentally, turn down the volume a little bit?
Yeah.
Are you missing out on time with family or friends, right? Like all of those things. So it's back to like why I think where we started with, like, hey, what questions can you ask yourself? How do you check in just to make sure things are in the right space? How do you get back to that kind of like baseline or normal that you referenced or referred to?
And that's still coaching to me. Like, it's a different form of coaching. It's not, yes, I'm a sport coach, but like coaching still applies in all aspects of life. Like, whether you're at work, whether you're at with your family, it's still coaching. You're educating in some sense. And that's, to me, the definition of a coach is still, it's providing education to whoever you're working with. And that comes across all aspects of your life.
Well, it's like I appreciate that, because like in my current career, right, as a coach in a number of form and fashion, right, I think that's something I talk to a lot of people about, is right, like, coaches in our life, right? It's ways we can learn, get insight, get expertise, be shown new things, open new doors, right? Like, coaches can serve in a multitude of ways, and I think that's a great transition to talk a little bit about what you're doing now, right? Because it's just another form of coaching. And I think it's really interesting because it kind of loops back to your glide path on your entire career. So Could you talk a little bit more about the science part of your current path?
Yeah. So currently I work with a wearable tech company, Player Data, and it's GPS units that in all aspects, all different sports from soccer to American football to lacrosse to field hockey. It basically no different than your watch. We're collecting GPS data, no different than when I was working in team sports. We take that data and we help try to provide, you know, analysis to help teams get the answers they want. So within my current role is I do work with a handful of teams and customers and help them kind of go about one, collecting data the right way, and then two, interpreting that data, and then trying to help them answer the questions they want to answer. And whether that be from a management side, a performance side, uh, we kind of help guide them along that path, but also help give them the keys to interpret them itself. And part of our product, is like, are we able to make this, easy enough to use that you don't have to be a part of a big, professional sports organization to acquire it, to use it, to interpret it. We're there to help kind of get you on your way and teach you some of those lessons and teach you, okay, I've collected this session. What does that mean? Okay, well, here's different metrics you can look for. Here's what, different speed zones you can look for, and how does that potentially impact your players?
Yeah, and I think the way you set this up, I think is perfect because again, it just kind of harkens back to how we've started and chatted throughout this conversation, right? Is a lot of your time has been spent at the elite athlete level, but everything you have shared, every story you kind of laid out, right? Like we can apply these principles at our level in everything we do, right? From a training approach, from mentally and physically, checking in and asking like where we are and what we're doing, right? Things like recovery, right? The recovery can be the same. And I think this last one is kind of the nature of where we are from a societal perspective, meaning tech and information, right? GPS units. I'm not wearing the GPS unit, right, when I walk around the office to see how many steps I've taken or what angle I'm making a cut. But if I'm wearing my Apple Watch, it's kind of the same premise. We have access to all this information and data, when it comes to all of those like glucose monitors and Aura rings and Apple Watches, right? And I think what you said is like, how do we interpret it and what do we do with it is a big question. Like data is everywhere. And I think now more than ever, it's like, how do we interpret the data and what do we do with it? So that's a very long-winded to ask and throw it back to you is like, you do it at an elite level. How can people start to access that even at that level I'm talking about?
I mean, like you said, whether you have, a Garmin or an Apple Watch, you're collecting data of some sorts. And I think it's depending on I always go, people want to see the performance benefits of that, but I like to say, hey, here's a way that you can kind of manage how your week is gone and stuff. And or from a day-to-day perspective, whether, I had 20,000 steps today, I'm kind of tired from that. That's still long-winded. Or I did, 5-mile run with some intense repeats. Is you have that data is in a simplest way that I usually try to explain it is if one day seemed higher, if you've collected a week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks of data, like you still need data to be able to analyze and interpret it. You're not going to make a lot of decisions off of 2 sessions or 2 days collected. But if you can see, well, 3 days in a row, I was high here or I ran 10 miles, 10 miles, 10 miles. And well, on day 4, that like really made me kind of not feel great and stuff. So an approach to look at it is like, if I had a high day of 10 miles, what's my next day? Is it going to be lower than that? Do I then get some recovery from that? And then can I go back up to a high approach and then to a low approach? So I think with just the information that you can collect, and especially from a workout, steps or running, whatever type of workout you did, was your heart rate high for that window that you're working out? Okay, well, the next day, if I try to maintain that same output, it's feasible, but that's going to still accumulate a lot more residual fatigue that's probably going to come in the next day or two. And then if you try to keep out in that high approach, it's generally you're going to start to dig a hole, and then it's going to be much harder to come out. So really is, if I have information, I know this looked high to me, and all the workouts I did, I felt hard. It felt hard. Okay, well, what's my next day look like? I need to scale back a little bit, because you're then really providing recovery in the most general way that you possibly can. And that's just a high-low approach. You're not having to do the additional boots or like, targeted stretching. You're just managing your workload. And by doing that, you're recovering and adapting to the stimulus that you're providing yourself.
Yeah, I think, again, the parallels are kind of very interesting. And I think I would love to do is, take everything we've spent the last 45 minutes chatting on, but, sitting in this chair, or for anyone who listens in, again, hearkening back to the expertise that you have, and then all the work you've done with the elite athletes, what are like 2, 3, 4 things that people can take away that's saying like, look, this is from an elite world, this is what we're doing, and this translates over this space? Like, hey, 2 or 3, 4 lessons that people can start to implement into their own life from that side.
I think understand where you're at from a capacity, and okay, it's I think it's important to set goals. If you don't have a goal, it's still kind of hard to manage that, because to be consistent. So set a goal, understand where you're at, and then work back from there of how you apply that in terms of working out. I do think being aware of your schedule and what's coming up and what may happen, and being proactive with that is another part. And that's primarily what I would do within my role. Is we would look at a calendar. We know we had this game here, this game here. We know there was travel involved with that. Well, how do we set ourselves up to do that? And then if we know we have 3 holiday parties and then a trip, and then now I have to come back and work. So how am I going to set myself up to achieve the goals that I want, or to do the things I want to do from a workout or physical standpoint? And the next part is just understanding that recovery is not linear. Just because you did a workout one day, that the next day or next week you're going to feel magically better. There's a lot more things that go into it. But understanding to go off how you feel and to do things that make you feel good. Generally, when you kind of stay consistent with that and go off of, hey, I'm not feeling great, but I'm going to do something that makes me feel good, whether that be, a walk, recovery, socializing with friends and stuff, that will generally kind of add some recovery to you and help you bounce back. But understanding that the different things are going to come in. So from one week to the next week, it's not always going to be the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, right? Like, I think the idea of whether you're coaching someone at Oklahoma, the World Cup, pro soccer within the women's world, right? Like, these are the same things you told your athletes then, and you're telling an individual now, right? These principles apply.
Yeah, a lot of the principles have also just been kind of you guinea pig on yourself, and then it's like, okay, well, that kind of worked for me. Well, this potentially could work for somebody else. But then if it doesn't, then you take that lesson and then you're like, okay, well, how do we tweak this a little bit more? And then how do we get a little bit more, it's just conversation and communication with that athlete or with that client that you have. And the more you can kind of understand them on an individual level, that's where you can tweak your application and your methods to ultimately help them.
Yeah, that's great. And, I think I really appreciate, the way you framed it. I loved some of the things you referenced, right? Like, things, money in the bank, and you are where you are, right? Those are all things we can apply in our own lives. Checking in, right? Just asking yourself, like, hey, did I sleep well? How am I feeling? And then when you go look at that plan, right? Like, to your point, if it's a 20-mile run or a 5-mile run or anything in between for someone, right? Like, understanding that, no, you can't do that every day. We're saying, hey, I'm going to back off. But
you're also not going to lose a lot from it if you reschedule it on another time. Yeah. It's like, I know you have that marathon plan. It's like, if you don't do that 20-mile run on Saturday, November 20th, like, you're going to be okay if you adjust it or if you break it up. So I think it's like, just because it's on the schedule doesn't mean you can modify it and adjust it. You can still get the same benefit.
That's a hard lesson I had to learn in my early days, as you well know.
You and I both.
we could share a bunch of stories, but I would love to just kind of ask a few additional questions. One, right, like I would again, all of your time spent in kind of an elite athlete world, like any favorite stories, any favorite experiences? I know I've used that picture of you holding that trophy, but anything like that you could share?
I mean, my experience at Oklahoma was great because I think it really shaped how I went about my career and kind of the things. And I was lucky enough to have, again, a head coach, a boss that ultimately was a mentor that was definitely patient the first 2 years as I was a young 26-year-old thinking that like, I know everything. I know this is going to work. And then really by the third year of my stint there, really having to kind of uh, adjust almost everything and like learn a different way. And it's not learning; it's just I had to change some things, and I think by it just that helped then kickstart everything. And we were successful that year, at least making the NCAA tournament. And then my last year at Oklahoma, we ended up program record for wins, and then also the first ever NCAA tournament for the team. So I think that was probably from an experience standpoint when I look back at it of hey, that's where I really kind of shaped and molded who I was as a coach. And then along the way, I wasn't afraid to take a step back, to take a step forward. And I think I've done that to whether, and luckily I also have a partner and a wife that is has been patient with some of those decisions to whether I'm moving to San Diego, living in a van, or throughout the 2019 World Cup being gone 152 days of the year is doing some of the dirty work. And then you still get it, like you're a part of it and you learn everything. And I was still able to apply, but also by doing some of the dirty work or being kind of uncomfortable or finding some of the struggle, I think you come out on the other side and you not only respect it more, I think when you then come across those situations again, you understand how to handle them a lot better. And so I think those are two probably the biggest experiences that I've had in my career that really shaped and molded who I am.
Well, and I mean, everything you just shared, all right, that's from a professional perspective. What I think is really interesting is knowing you as well as I do, right? Like that applies in like the race world, right? Like
100%. It's still your like I mean you want to compete against yourself, and I think it depending on I've had great highs with racing and stuff, and I've also now in this latest challenge with our son Hank being born in October, it was probably the longest stretch. I wouldn't say of the inactivity, but definitely not the activity level that I was used to. And then now I'm kind of started back to that, where in the last 10 weeks, I've been more consistent than I have been, normal to or kind of what we were used to. So I think that goes back to what we said. It's like I had to understand I'm at where I'm at. And then also the different things that have come into my life, it caused me to adjust and be aware of, hey, I need to go about things a little differently, which is okay.
yeah, and I was telling my wife Allison that as you know her very well, that you were coming on and we were sharing the one story talk about stressors. I think it was you beat me by like I can't remember what year it was, but you beat me by like 5 minutes at Ironman Arizona.
I think it was less than that. I mean, I think it was like you were 10:04 and I was at 10:01.
And you got sick
2011.
a couple times.
I got sick on the first like 2 miles of the run because I decided to take the Tums to think that it was going to help me, and it did not. So
Well,
lesson learned.
the funny part is we were sharing the story because like you come in, I come in, and I think we all hopped in the car. She drove us both home, but the part we were laughing about is I think we stopped and got you like an ice cream sundae because you
It's
couldn't get
froyo,
any.
yeah. I think it was froyo. That was the only thing that I could eat. And you're over here like a just crushing down fries
Oh, the
and
fries at the
everything.
end. Yeah, those are my
Yeah.
favorite.
I was just I felt really good that day and I thought I was gonna do it. And then like within the first 2 miles of the run, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna finish
I remember, yeah, they
this.
would serve those fries at the end. It was like just a fried potato, but then it was like a bag
Yeah.
of salt. I've never probably had more
Yeah.
soda cream on a single fry in my entire life.
I mean, we definitely had some good races, and I feel like that's something in terms of what you could take for your life is in the pro side of things, you're within a team environment. So that's why I absolutely loved it, because it was, everybody is searching for that common goal. And I think as we become adults or we're training on our own, we oftentimes don't have some of that community to do that. But you'll see that when you do find, a couple, whether that be one person, two people, maybe a group that runs together, it's like it's usually going to drive your performance. And you'll see a much different, like, you not only push yourself, but I do think you end up adapting much better than when you're kind of going on it alone.
Yeah, I mean, something I preach here is community, right? Like when we go through change and transformation, it's so important to have community and the right tools and or resources around you, right? Because
Yeah,
there's no such
huge.
thing as stasis. We are never standing still, and that's an important part. And I think that maybe sets up, perhaps our last question before I turn it over to you to kind of like close everything out. But my favorite book, people have heard it on multiple occasions, or one of my favorite books is The Comfort Crisis, and in that gets talked about the Masogi story, all right? Like, hey, this really big thing, right? And then there's a few rules according to Michael Easter. It's 50-50 chance of success, have fun, don't die, right? Like those are three pretty good rules. Do you have one of those on the horizon in the next year? I know you've gotten way deep into golf recently.
I've kind of gotten, back and forth. Is I think also, I mean, my wife inspires me quite a bit. Like, she was a former collegiate runner. She's coming postpartum off our first child, and she's about to do. She actually just did her first kind of like real race. It was a 5K a couple weeks ago, and absolutely obliterated the time that she was going to think she was going to get. So she's doing a half marathon here in a couple weeks in San Bernardino, or the Big Bear half. But she is so disciplined, and every day is just, I'm getting up, I'm working out, doesn't matter. So that's kind of helped motivate me a little bit to get back into. I qualified for Boston to run in 2020, but we all know what happened. And then so from back there, it's like I did a fair amount of work to kind of run like a bucket list race that I ended up not doing. So I do think that is on the horizon, but for me, that is definitely a 2025 goal. But in the same time, I am very dedicated to golf right now. And it's another thing, you're competing against yourself. And once you get that little bit of a bug, I would like to do 18-mile run and the 18 holes of golf in one day, walking. So run and then do a full walk of a course would be kind of, and see if I can play well doing that. Because to me, it marries like do the things that I love, and that's, endurance training and running. And then do I have enough of capacity in me to then go out and execute a golf swing and to be able to do that for 18 holes?
Well, and I think there's that's the kind of the mashup of the two. And I think a former elite or professional Arizona athlete, Eric Burns, did like
Yeah, I've seen it.
24 hours of running with playing golf at the same time on a course or something like
Yeah.
that.
I mean, those guys, I did see like a guy do an 18 and 18. So that definitely, to me, it's enough of a carrot to know that, okay, I can get the best of both worlds right here.
I love it. Well, I'm going to hand it back to you. Where can they find your company, information, things you're doing?
Playerdata.com is the best way to, if you wanted to learn any bit of information, whether that be from a team standpoint, or we do sell the unit that is an individual unit that, if you're a youth athlete and you want to start to get access to your data, we do provide that. And that's the cool thing about player data, is what an individual user gets is no different than some of the information that the team gets as well, from the professional teams and college teams that we have. You can look at me on LinkedIn, Buddy Huttanus, and then just even reach out, email buddyhuttanus@gmail.com.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because like it's all coming, right? Like to your point, team down to individual, all of that data is on the way.
Yeah.
It just depends on where you want to be on the curve.
Yep. And it's just, it could be a little bit overwhelming, but again, it's still, it's you can see trends, and you'll be able, if you're open to kind of learning a little bit about it, you can actually get a massive benefit by collecting it.
Man, it was so good to see you again. Catch up as always.
Yeah,
This is
no, it was great, exciting. This is, I appreciate you having me on here. I'm definitely stoked with what you're doing with all this. It's definitely exciting to see, and I know you've been at it for a while. So I was kind of pushing you to be on some of the podcast side of things, and also I thought the other type of things of pushing your boundaries is a lot of that influence does come from you. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you having me on.
I appreciate it, man. I learned so much. I was I was the knucklehead trying to run 20 miles like every day or something like that, and you're like, no, that's probably not a great idea. So.
Yeah, for your listeners, I do give Adam sound advice. I feel like at times now, whether he takes it or not, it's
I
completely
do
up to him.
now. I didn't then. I'm old though now.
But hey, that's part of coaching. Sometimes you gotta learn on your own. But if you at least kind of give them the right direction, they tend to figure it out.
Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
I appreciate it. Take care.